The World Cup in Qatar has already failed. That might seem like a bit of an odd statement to make. After all, we normally reflect upon the legacy of a World Cup and its successes and failures from the host perspective after the tournament is finished, and sometimes years after it is finished, not weeks before it has even begun. But then again, this is no ordinary World Cup. Contrary to popular opinion, countries that host the World Cup don't actually make money. Certainly not as a direct result of hosting the tournament, but not even after taking every tangible external long-term factor into account. Hosting the World Cup is very expensive. South Africa spent $3.6 billion in 2010, Brazil spent $11.6 billion in 2014, and Russia spent a record-breaking $14.2 billion in the most expensive World Cup to date in 2018. None of those countries recouped that investment or even came remotely close. And that is unsurprising given that FIFA retains all ticket, merchandise, goods, media and television rights for the World Cup, so host nations receive none of that revenue, and not just that, FIFA also insists, as part of the World Cup bidding process, that all of the proceeds that they generate through the sales of tickets, merchandise, television rights and everything else remain entirely tax-free, meaning that the host nation not only doesn't get a share of that revenue, they don't even collect any tax receipts. No wonder FIFA wants a World Cup every 2 years. The World Cup in Qatar is estimated to have cost the hosts around $220 billion for all stadium, transport and related infrastructure projects, so this World Cup was always going to lose money and a heck of a lot of it. But that was never the metric by which the success or failure of this tournament would be measured. Success for Qatar at this World Cup would be laundering the state and its regime's reputation, increasing foreign investment into the country, creating an image in people's minds of Qatar as being a modern, forward-thinking country, and raising the nation's profile as a desirable tourist destination long-term. It is all part of Qatar's aim, like so many of its neighbouring countries, to diversify their economies away from oil long-term, legitimise their undemocratic, authoritarian, and often tyrannical regimes, and to extend their soft power and solidify their power base, particularly within the region. It's not dissimilar to Russia's motives for hosting the World Cup 4 years ago, just on steroids. But whilst Russia was very successful in achieving those aims at the World Cup, there is good reason to believe that Qatar has already failed, and all that remains to be seen is the extent to which this World Cup is an unmitigated disaster. It is not unusual for World Cups to be controversial. Japan and South Korea were considered to be contentious hosts in 2002 because the time difference meant that games would be played in the morning for European fans, disrupting the working day of FIFA's most profitable viewers. Germany's winning bid in 2006 was so controversial that it forced FIFA to change the way in which the bidding process worked, as Germany beat South Africa by 12 votes to 11 in the final round, after New Zealand FIFA executive member Charlie Dempsey abstained at the last minute, despite having been instructed by the Oceania Football Confederation to vote for South Africa, which would have tied the votes at 12-all. Dempsey said that he abstained because of intolerable pressure from both the German and South African bidding teams and attempted bribes, stepping down months after the vote. Meanwhile, 3 German officials and 1 FIFA official were later charged with fraud for their roles in the bidding process. Thankfully, because of the changes in practice that were implemented by FIFA because of that scandal, in the 16 years since, there haven't been any controversial World Cup hosts. Nah, I'm just kidding. FIFA executive Chuck Blazer admitted that he and others on the FIFA Executive Committee had accepted bribes in relation to South Africa's successful bid to host the 2010 World Cup in 2004, and there were even reports that Morocco had actually received more bids than South Africa, but that South Africa had still been chosen as host regardless. Meanwhile, the host nation themselves were accused of displacing people, mostly impoverished and homeless people or refugees, to make space for fan parks, infrastructure projects, and to try and reduce crime. The 2014 World Cup in Brazil was so controversial that it prompted mass protests across the country in 2013 and 2014, before the tournament had even begun, with riots and civil unrest in several Brazilian cities. The controversy revolved largely around the amount of public spending and national debt that the government was spending on the tournament, which many felt would have been better spent elsewhere in a country where poverty remains rife. The Wikipedia article entitled List of 2014 FIFA World Cup Controversies is a fairly lengthy read, and it includes subheadings such as protests, monorail collapse, and bridge collapse. Yeah, that is rarely a good sign. I don't think I need to get into the controversy surrounding the 2018 World Cup in Russia. That would constitute an entire video in of itself. The point being here, there has never been a squeaky clean FIFA World Cup. Whether it is the bidding process, the safety of workers, or the actual practicalities of the tournament itself, there are always issues. The difference with the 2022 World Cup is that there are only issues, scandals, and controversy, and virtually no benefits. The kickoff times in South Korea and Japan, and the distance between the two countries at the first World Cup to have more than a single host nation may have been controversial. But it was also the first World Cup to be held in Asia by two mature democracies where football was enjoying rapid expansion and both had half-decent teams and football pedigree. Germany's winning bid may have been a little bit suspect, but the country itself couldn't be much better prepared to host the World Cup in terms of the football culture, stadiums, and transport links. And despite being the second most successful nation in the history of the competition, Germany had never previously hosted the World Cup. South Africa was the first World Cup in Africa, in a football-mad nation that benefited enormously from related infrastructure projects. The nation of Brazil is as suitable as a World Cup host as it is imaginable to be, and even Russia is a country with immense football heritage. It is literally the biggest country in the entire world, and it had never hosted a World Cup, either as Russia or as part of the USSR, nor had any country from the former Soviet bloc. That is why, when Russia and Qatar were announced jointly as host countries for the 2018 and 2022 World Cups back in December 2010, there was a bit less scrutiny around Russia's undoubtedly questionable winning bid, because everything about Qatar's winning bid was quite so ludicrous. Qatar is a tiny country, by far the smallest ever to have hosted the World Cup, smaller than Albania and Lithuania in terms of population, and smaller than Vanuatu, Northern Ireland, and even the Falkland Islands by landmass. Qatar has next to no football heritage, never having qualified for the World Cup, and they ranked outside of the top 100 of the FIFA World Rankings, and had only once got out of the group stage of even the Asian Cup when they were selected as host nation in 2010. The country had virtually no football infrastructure, with just one notable football stadium, the Khalifa International Stadium, which had a capacity of just 20,000 in 2010, and they had even less ability to accommodate or move around the more than 1 million football fans that typically descend upon a host nation when they hold the FIFA World Cup. Qatar welcomed fewer than 600,000 international tourists in 2020, and even fewer when they won their bid to host the World Cup in 2010, which is fewer than countries like Iraq, Libya, and Malawi. It's fewer even than Malta, which is a tiny archipelago with a population of around 500,000 people. These are just the practical hurdles to Qatar hosting the World Cup, along with the tremendous heat there in the summer, which forced the tournament to be moved to the winter despite Qatar claiming that they could host it in the summer, which was a lie, let alone the fact that it was rapidly shown to have been the most corrupt bidding process in the entire history of an organisation that is quite famous for ludicrously corrupt bidding processes. Qatar itself is a repressive, authoritarian, monarchical dictatorship where the rights of women, LGBT people, and migrant workers, predominantly from South Asian countries, are frequently abused, abuses that are often enshrined in law, And to add the icing to the utterly absurd World Cup host cake, it would be those migrant workers who would build the stadiums, related infrastructure projects, and necessary roads and metro lines to transport and accommodate the fans that Qatar was utterly ill-equipped to deal with in the first place. Consequently, this is a World Cup, and was always going to be a World Cup, built on the backs of people who were, at best, brutally exploited, could most accurately be described as indentured servants, and who in some cases could quite reasonably be described as modern-day slaves, many of whom have since died as a result of heat exhaustion, malnutrition, and squalid living conditions. We know that between 2010 and 2021, as reported by The Guardian, at least 6,500 migrant workers died in Qatar, the vast majority of them previously fit and healthy working-age men. Not all of the 6,500 dead were working on World Cup-related projects, but that figure is also taken only from the official death certificates of migrant workers from 5 Southeast Asian countries, meaning that the real number is likely to be significantly higher. The only arguable, redeeming feature of Qatar as World Cup hosts is that they are the first country in Western Asia to host the World Cup, and the first predominantly Muslim nation or Arab world nation to do so, which really would seem to be clutching at straws to me, but it would be remiss of me not to at least mention it. The gamble that Qatar, and indeed FIFA, took was that whilst there would inevitably be some anger, confusion, inquest, and investigation around Qatar's bizarre selection as World Cup hosts, once the football started, everyone would focus on that and forget about everything else. It is a gamble which paid off in Russia, where initial criticism and skepticism largely subsided once the tournament began, fan trouble was kept to a minimum, and everything went fairly smoothly, at least from an operational standpoint. The World Cup was a major success story for Vladimir Putin in terms of legitimizing his regime, normalizing relations with businesses and other countries, and portraying Russia in a positive light, following plenty of criticism after the country's invasion of Crimea in 2014, mass protests between 2011 and 2013, increased crackdowns and disappearances of political opponents, and, at least from a UK perspective, also the poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal just months before the tournament began. At the end of the 2018 World Cup, FIFA President Gianni Infantino declared, "This country, Russia, has changed," adding, "Everyone has discovered a beautiful country, a welcoming country, full of people who are keen to show to the world that what maybe is sometimes said is not what happens here." Vladimir Putin, meanwhile, claimed that he was, quote, "thrilled that our guests saw everything with their eyes, and that myths and prejudice collapsed." 4.5 years on, none of those claims have aged particularly well, with Russia having become a pariah among much of the international community, and even having been banned by both UEFA and FIFA themselves after significantly escalating their invasion of Ukraine earlier on this year. Nonetheless, Infantino and Putin's bluster was reflective of a World Cup that had accomplished its primary goal. It hadn't made any money, of course. Most of the stadiums are now half or three-quarters empty, and there is little evidence that it left any significant footballing legacy in terms of the game in Russia. But it did sanitize the Putin regime, briefly. It projected the image that the Kremlin wanted both abroad and, even more significantly, back at home to Russia's own citizens, and the $14 billion of investment, whilst never recouped, did create a significant number of jobs and economic activity in Russia. That last point is one minor but very obvious distinction between not just Russia and Qatar hosting the World Cup, but actually Qatar in comparison to every previous World Cup host. The majority of jobs created by hosting the World Cup are in the construction and hospitality sectors, and the World Cup in Qatar has created more jobs, estimated to be over 1.5 million, than any other World Cup. Unlike every other World Cup though, most of those vacancies haven't been filled by domestic citizens, in this case Qataris, but rather they have been filled by extremely low paid and, in some cases, entirely unpaid migrant workers. This is great as far as the Qatari state is concerned, in the sense that it is very cheap labour that almost all of the Gulf states rely on to actually build things or get anything done in those countries, but there is no direct increase in prosperity for the people of Qatar. Qatar's migrant workers are far too poor to participate in the wider economy. The country has a two-tiered economy that caters to two groups of people with very different income levels and social status, and most of the tiny amount of money that those migrant workers have made won't even remain in Qatar, since they will have been sending money back, if they have been able to generate any savings, to their families, and almost all of them will return to their countries of origin once those jobs no longer exist at the end of this World Cup. There will still be some construction projects and hospitality roles in Qatar after the World Cup, but clearly the number of both will be vastly diminished. That is just one conventional benefit of hosting a World Cup that Qatar won't experience. The biggest benefits, typically, are the infrastructure and transport networks that get built for the tournament and remain extremely beneficial to people after the World Cup ends, and the ability to project a certain image of your country to the rest of the world. The 2010 World Cup in South Africa, for example, opened a lot of people's eyes to the idea not just of South Africa, but the entire continent of Africa to a certain extent, as a tourist destination. They saw thriving, busy and energetic cities, beautiful landscapes, and welcoming people on their television screens. They might not have visited South Africa during the World Cup specifically, but the next time they were planning a trip somewhere, they might have thought of South Africa for the first time, and this is reflected in the country's tourism statistics. This was doubly useful in the case of a country like South Africa, that is often portrayed as being either poor, corrupt, or dangerous throughout much of the world, and still struggles with the legacy of apartheid. So the World Cup gave South Africa the opportunity to seize their own narrative and present the country directly to billions of people in a more positive light, which is something that they did relatively effectively, only partially undermined by how irritating most people found the constant hum of the vuvuzela. It is considerably less useful to a country like France, which is already the most visited country on Earth and already has a reputation for incredible wine, food, scenery and landmarks, sunny beaches in the south, and the city of love in the north, and so on and so forth. And France actually saw a decline in the total number of tourists that visited the country whilst the World Cup was on in the summer of 1998, despite the influx of football fans, with some non-football fan tourists put off by the higher prices, traffic jams, and the prospect of hooliganism. It is worth caveating that with the fact that countries like France and Germany, where there is less benefit image-wise when it comes to hosting the World Cup, are already much better equipped to host a major football tournament without the need for enormous investment, and whatever investment is required tends to be a much smaller percentage of their GDP than is the case with a poorer country like South Africa or Brazil. As for Qatar, increasing tourism as a result of hosting the World Cup is arguably more important to them than any previous World Cup host. As with fellow Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, Qatar is nominally very wealthy. It is the fourth or fifth richest country in the world in terms of GDP per capita, but their economy is entirely dependent upon a single sector. Not only that, the sector in question, oil and gas, are finite resources, the extraction and burning of which, as these countries know better than almost anyone else, is predicted to make parts of the Middle East uninhabitable within the next couple of decades, and most likely the entire region within this century. There is an enormous economic, environmental, and indeed simply survival motive, therefore, for these countries to divest and halt fossil fuel exploration, but since they are entirely dependent upon fossil fuels to sustain their wealth, prosperity, and standard of living, they just keep on extracting, burning, and exporting. Gargantuan efforts have been made nonetheless, and billions of dollars spent, in the pursuit of diversifying the economies of countries like Qatar. Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, which recently acquired an 80% stake in Newcastle United, has a reported $620 billion in overseas assets under management for just that reason. But despite the Saudi Vision 2030 strategic framework that was first outlined in 2016 to diversify Saudi Arabia's economy away from oil and into the health, education, infrastructure, recreation, and tourism sectors, as of 2021, Saudi Arabia was still dependent upon oil exports to account for 75% of their national budget. Every Gulf state has one of these programs, and Qatar is no exception. All of their World Cup spending, estimated to be around $220 billion, comes under the banner of the Qatar National Vision 2030 project, first outlined in October 2008, and Qatar claims that only the $6.5 billion spent specifically on the World Cup stadiums has actually been added to that budget as a result of the country hosting the World Cup, and that the rest has merely been accelerated and would have happened regardless as part of their National Vision 2030 project. The most successful of these diversification projects has come in the United Arab Emirates, and specifically in the city of Dubai, which is now a major economic hub and tourist destination. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, and other countries in the Persian Gulf have been considerably less successful, and there is little reason to believe, at least at this stage, that Qatar's lofty aims when it comes to tourism are likely to prove to be a hit. Qatar is extremely expensive in terms of both food and accommodation. The country is very conservative, and local law enforcement are known to be pretty strict when it comes to dress, alcohol consumption, public displays of affection, and same-sex relationships. Now, I am not saying that you shouldn't visit Qatar, and I'm sure it is full of fantastic people, beaches, and architecture, but in a recent minute-long marketing campaign led by Qatar's tourist board in conjunction with David Beckham, Golden Ball stated that Qatar had one of the best spice markets that he had ever been to, and ended the video with the claim that it, quote, really is an incredible place to spend a few days on a stopover. If the very best thing that you can find to say about visiting an entire country in a solitary minute is essentially, if you're looking to refuel en route to somewhere more interesting, you can pick up some half-decent paprika whilst you wait, you're probably not off to a winner. Not only am I skeptical about the long-term benefits that Qatar is likely to gain as a result of hosting the World Cup, even during the World Cup, there are likely to be far fewer tourists than usual. Demand for tickets was so low that even tickets for the England games weren't immediately snapped up, and England fans travel unlike the supporters of almost any other national team. At the time of this recording, you can still buy tickets for several World Cup games, and you can even buy hospitality tickets for the final. Fans have been put off visiting Qatar for a number of reasons, some of them practical, and some of them moral. The country's vast array of human rights abuses and the disgraceful treatment of migrant workers has not been swept under the rug in the way that both FIFA and Qatar hoped that they would. Both generally and for tourism purposes, Qatar has unequivocally failed to launder the country and its authorities' reputations. People across much of the world are more inquisitive and informed than ever before. Players have taken a stand and are planning further gestures, we are led to believe, and FIFA even had to intervene recently to discourage critics. The statement, written by FIFA President Gianni Infantino, was a total car crash from start to finish. Infantino pleaded, but please do not allow football to be dragged into every ideological or political battle that exists, and stated that one of the great strengths of the world is indeed its very diversity, and if inclusion means anything, it means having respect for that diversity. No one people or culture or nation is better than any other. This is typical FIFA hand-washing and deception, trying to tie up perfectly legitimate criticism with bigotry and xenophobia. Whilst no one people are indeed innately better than any other, quite obviously, that doesn't mean that some governments and regimes aren't worse than others. ISIS are bad not because of the innate physical characteristics of their members or leadership, but because of the things that they believe and the acts that they carry out. Nazi Germany was bad, not because the Nazis were white or because Hitler had a dodgy tash, but because of all the fascism, death camps and genocide that came as a direct consequence of Nazi rhetoric and ideology. In a recent video that I made about which politics are allowed in football and which aren't, I commented that I didn't expect FIFA to push back or condemn criticism of Qatar because the Streisand effect is well known at this stage, and doing so would not only push controversies around the World Cup even higher up the news agenda, it also risks creating a game of chicken and escalation whereby if FIFA sought to punish teams or players for making statements or gestures about Qatar, those teams would take even more evasive action, more elaborate protests, and could even threaten to boycott if the organisation isn't careful. It turns out that FIFA and Infantino are much less intelligent than I initially gave them credit for, and not only have they pushed back, they have done so in the most dreadfully written and ill-thought-out statement imaginable. It's for that reason that I don't think that the public will forget about the issues in Qatar at this World Cup, even when the football starts, like they did in Russia. Qatar has not been able to cultivate an image of itself as a modern, progressive and forward-thinking country, but, quite literally, has just strengthened people's beliefs that it is borderline medieval in some regards, extremely regressive, and is guilty of mass human rights abuses. Even people who aren't particularly politically engaged and don't follow the news all that much are at least partially aware of the controversy surrounding this World Cup and have a negative perception of it. There is undoubtedly, not just because of all the reasons that I've just stated, but also the timing, far less enthusiasm around this World Cup than any other in living memory throughout much of the world. And whilst I don't think that all that many people will boycott it entirely and refuse to watch any of the games, I do think that it is unlikely that their view of Qatar will have been radically changed, that doing business with the Qatari state will be deemed any more palatable to most people, or that many more people will be planning a holiday there as a result of this World Cup. Of course, even if Qatar didn't experience any uptick in tourism, they would still have the infrastructure and transport networks that were built for the World Cup. Except, even that doesn't quite apply to Qatar. The stadiums will be pointless after the World Cup, some will be dismantled, others will be repurposed, and the rest will be left as enormous empty white elephants with no occupants or purpose. The major infrastructure and transport links, like metro stations and new lines, have been built primarily to serve those stadiums and football fans at the World Cup. Talk to anyone who is actually in Qatar or who has been there, and they will tell you that many of those stations and lines are like ghost towns even now, and that there is no need for them other than the World Cup. It is of course possible that that could change, but there is little evidence or suggestion that it will. If anyone thinks that it is far too early to predict that a World Cup is going to be a failure, I would remind them of the 1978 World Cup in Argentina, which was considered illegitimate, shrouded in controversy, and deeply corrupt before a ball had even been kicked, given that Argentina had been subject to a coup in 1976, after which the country became a dictatorship led by a right-wing military junta. Almost half a century on, the 1978 World Cup is still considered by many to have been illegitimate, shrouded in controversy, and deeply corrupt. And I think that the same will be true, to an even greater extent, of the World Cup in Qatar in years to come. There is also the possibility that problems relating particularly to accommodation and logistical issues actually further damage the Qatari brand, if you like, and could be a source of great humiliation, given that this is a World Cup which had a virtually limitless budget and the use of either low-paid or, in some cases, entirely unpaid labour. This was the one area where Qatar wasn't supposed to have any issues. Yet, just weeks away from the tournament kicking off, whilst the stadiums themselves look fantastic, we are seeing images of unfinished hotels, frankly dangerous fan parks, and accommodation, costing $207 a night might I add, that currently looks like this. I can see absolutely no problems with having thousands of football fans, all supporting different national teams, in one of the few designated sites in Qatar where you can actually drink alcohol, being crammed in all together in several hundred shipping containers in the middle of a desert. This is the stuff that I wouldn't feel confident making any predictions about because they should be fixed or ironed out, and Qatar has the resources to do that. But at least from afar, and from what some of those on the ground are saying as well, this is hardly reassuring. It sure would be a shame if this massively expensive and deeply shameful propaganda exercise ended up being a humiliating farce. Right, I am going to end there because this video is already very long, and I'm sure that this isn't the last time that I'll be talking about Qatar and the World Cup on this channel. So all of the other things that I wanted to say, I'm sure I'll find a way of shoehorning them in somewhere else. Thank you all very much as ever for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it or found it informative in some way, shape or form. Hit the like button if that was the case. It is completely free of charge and apparently it helps me. You can also follow, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, leave a comment, and find me on either Instagram or on Twitter via the username @HITC Sevens should you wish to do so.